This is a collection of daily contributions to some Lethbridge history Facebook groups over the years. By this time in my life, my ad-libbing had passed its best before date, so from time to time I've had to correct the old guy. You may want to stop and read more. In the 1970s, it was the decade of the trek, the AV trek. We started at Fort Macleod here, and much in the nearby area was settled by early Mounties. You'll note the arrows are pointing to the first fort, which was on an island, and the second fort, which was above the gradient of the river, and therefore no floods. The first fort was abandoned in 1893. You'll see some paths going to and from the fort. Looks like a railway line that was put in later. And we'll move on. Now, I want you to look carefully at this fort and notice no bastions, no big corner posts with gun slots and the whole bit. But when the 1950s arrived, Fort Macleod decided to put up a tourist attraction model of what the fort looked like, and it's still there, but it's not what the fort originally looked like at all. Again, looking at the diorama of the fort found at the museum, and contrast it with the picture of the original photograph from 1876. So you can see a similarity there, but not in the replica that was put up. And as I said before, in 1883, the went above ground and the fort expanded. In the 1940s, I remember we would go to Waterton Lakes and we would pass by buildings that were still there at that time. And it was fast becoming a rodeo grounds, as I recall. Now, back in the early 70s, former police chief Carpenter and his wife took my class out, and we learned how to map out archaeological sites, looking for all kinds of gems that were still lying around in the fields. Lake Minnewanka. Now, people think of Banff, they think of Lake Minnewanka, and it was quite an historic area. This is the area where Peter Fiddler came through in 1792. He passed by, and then actually going into the gap called the Devil's Gap was Sir George Simpson in 1841 as he was making a world tour. In 1886, there was a community that started to be built in the area, and there was a beach house and the whole bit. But in 1921, this area was flooded when they built a hydroelectric dam, Calgary Power it was, and again they expanded it in 1941. So 1921, 1941, expansion of hydroelectric dam power and so on. And nowadays you can go and you can snorkel the area and go and discover the community that is below the surface of Lake Minnewanka. And here's the description you can read for yourself. You just pause the film, have a look. Devil's Head. This is the Devil's Head, very famous landmark to the early explorers. Here's one of my students as we visited the area and the Palliser Range nearby. Jerry Potts. He was a guide to the early Mounties. In fact, when they got lost down in the southern part of the province and ended up at Fort Benton, Montana, it was Jerry Potts who guided them to the WhoopUp Trail and to Fort WhoopUp. And my interest here was to show how they take the original photograph that you can see here on the right, and it's been copied so many times. There you'll find a copy. Let's move on to the next one. Here's Corne Martens, who was helping us with our trek project, made a model of the Jerry Potts, and later it was sculptured into bronze. And a bubblegum card put out about the same year. 27 refers to a number. This was used in a display at the Lethbridge Public Library, and that's why it has the number. Has no meaning whatsoever for this project. Up the Missouri and over the WhoopUp Trail comes next. Back in the 1979, 1980, I took the students to Montana. At one time, we actually floated down the Missouri River for 3 days. An amazing trip, and that's what you can see in this above picture here. The bottom picture shows you that the main area into southern Alberta was by the WhoopUp Trail, and here's a letter that was sent. Notice it says Northwest Mounted Police, has the person's name, Fort Macleod, spelled wrong, but anyway, Fort Macleod, Porcupine Hills via Benton, Montana Territory. And this is how they got all their mail from the east. It came by way of the Missouri River and then over the WhoopUp Trail, as did the people before the railway came. And here is the WhoopUp Trail going from Fort Benton to Fort Macleod. You can see the trail, and that's how they came. Now, this is a perfect example of the levee at Fort Benton. A levee, you say? Well, Fort Benton, even though it's a few hours away from where we are in southern Alberta, it was basically built up from New Orleans. And so you end up with a language that's completely different from a lot of the word terminology you would find in this part of the world, which developed from the east and from the north, the Hudson's Bay Company. Whereas the culture in Fort Benton came up the Missouri. So it's a very interesting location to visit. Here you can see a sign of the I.G. Baker Company, which was the company that expanded into southern Alberta and had points in Fort Macleod, Lethbridge, and Calgary. Eventually, the Lethbridge site was bought over by the Hudson's Bay Company. But it was originally a Montana company that started it all. At the museum in Fort Benton, you can see the Ox Team diorama showing the bull teams going up the Missouri River. And here's a famous painting by Charlie Russell showing the wagon train leaving Fort Benton to come up to Canada. Famous painting. And we left Fort Benton. We used our vans, stopped by a rancher, interviewed him, found out about the WhoopUp Trail, reminiscences of the area, and then we went on our way. And following along the trail, we found all kinds of artifacts, which were later brought to Lethbridge. I donated them to the museum, and they had a poor cataloging system at that time, or no cataloging system, and it would appear they were all lost. Here you can see an early American dime on the bottom left, a clasp on the right. They're carrying an old bucket. I don't know where it ever went, but there were all kinds of artifacts that were just lying around the fields of northern Montana. And you can see the feeling that you got of history, just wide open plains, nothing around. At the bottom here you'll see some of the comments that people made when this was presented to my news groups back in the area around 2010, when I started putting daily little bits of history on the social media platform for local history. Here you can see a plaque that's at the Canadian borders you come across on the WhoopUp Trail. And you can see the landscape changes when you get into Canada. You also begin to see a lot more settlement. Boy Scouts somewhere along the line painted rocks. I think they did it just before we were doing our trek so that they could help us find the places. Here you can see the W. It's a W in a circle for WhoopUp and our students. Now, as we approach the coulees above Fort WhoopUp, there's a long road. You can see on the upper right-hand corner the airport. So it's just south of the airport. There's a road goes straight west. And the arrow is pointing to a coulee where they built an overlook back in the early 1970s. And it lasted a few years. It was a really great spot. It was land that was donated by Frank Russell, a family that had been there since the year 1. And unfortunately, people started to have parties in the area, and eventually Frank said enough's enough, and they tore down the overlook. But it overlooked this particular valley. You can see the trail where the WhoopUp Trail went down through the coulees. Here are my students following along. And the overlook above. I took another group of students out, and we had to cross the St. Mary's River and worked our way to the site of Fort WhoopUp. Here's a monument that was put up, I believe, in 1947. It has the wrong date on it. It has 1867. I think it's supposed to be 1869. Here you can see some of the remnants of the fort. Not much left. It's an area that's, I believe, on the reserve, so it's a restricted area, but it is a National Historic Site. Here we are contemplating the area and where the structure was and the area around it. One of the students brought in a model that he had made, I think for a previous grade in elementary school, and he brought it in, and we compared it with the early document that we had showing what the fort looked like, and it matched pretty well. The WhoopUp flag. Originally, people that saw this picture, which is the only known picture of a flag flying above Fort WhoopUp, people mistakenly thought it was the American flag, and eventually, back in probably the late 60s, Hugh Dempsey and Alex Johnson analyzed it, and they said that no, it's not. They seemed that because it was mistaken for an American flag, they figured the colors must be the red and dark blue, but they said the stripes don't match up. Now, as a result, they designed this flag, and we now have it known as the WhoopUp flag, and it's the official flag, I believe, of Lethbridge. Others have tried to say that even this is incorrect, but by that time, the city had adopted this, and so this it is, the WhoopUp flag. Cypress Hills. Now, when we went on our trek in 1874, we passed through the area of the Cypress Hills where Fort Walsh is. Corne Martens, who went with us, taking on the part of Henri Julien, made a sketch of our, we had a van and a station wagon and a trailer as we went through the hills, passing by the grave of first Mountie that died in the area. Now let's talk about the classroom. I went out of my way to try to design a classroom that wasn't a classroom, more of a studio. And we got all kinds of little trinkets, ideas, and tried to convert it the best we could. It was supposed to be a working place, and in a large part it was. We even worked to make the building make the room the way it was by getting old scraps of carpet from local stores and making our own rug. This is equipment that we got from various grants. I had tried to get as much publicity as I could for the project, and this helped getting more grants to do all kinds of things. Here we are fixing the walls so that they're better with the sound for a studio. And of course, we went out of our way to use egg cartons. Pretty inexpensive way to convert a room so it's got the right ambience. Here we see the slides of the day. This is the way we did things in those days. This is your slideshow. We have movie projectors, movie cameras in the background there. You can see it was a fun place, and hopefully we learned a lot. One of our trips was to Fort Ellice. Fort Ellice is along the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, and it was originally one of the major fur trading posts of the West. When we got there, it was a very disappointing place. You can see in the middle picture there's an old bus that's been converted into his and hers washrooms. You can see parts of an old tank, an anti-aircraft gun, and this is not the way you would promote or keep your history alive. Those things had nothing to do with Fort Ellice. I think we did find one little grave marker, or part of a grave marker, and that was the only thing that showed that what the place really was. Corne Martens here, you can see him in the hat on the picture on the right, showing off a picture that he drew of what we saw when we got there. Now, the good story is that in 2012, the land was purchased by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and they say it's been cleaned up, so glad to hear. In the meantime, this is what we saw, which was down at the St. Lazare, which is a nearby town. One of the fellows that has a building supply store had a collection of knives and artifacts that have been found at the old fort over the years. So these are the remnants of what was a very historic place when the Mounties had arrived in 1874. This is a map of the route that shows you what part we're talking about. When the Mounties came from the west, they're going past Winnipeg to Fort Ellice. This is where we are. And the main group had come by this red line here. And they had gone south of Winnipeg. Now, at this point, a part of them branched off and went to Edmonton by way of Fort Ellice and up here, the Jarvis's route. He was in charge. The part of McLeod, under McLeod, and French, who was the commissioner, the main person, they went on the southern route. As we said earlier, they got fairly well lost in this area, went down to Fort Benton to get help. Jerry Potts helped them get back here, and they eventually found Fort WhoopUp and set up their mounted police post originally at Fort Macleod. One of the other places that we visited over the years, which was very exciting, was Lille. And Lille was named after Lille, France. Lille, France, is a place where the Western Canadian Collieries, the coal company, was established. That was their headquarters. And we're now in the Crowsnest Pass. But it was a kind of isolated part of the pass. And the place boomed as a coal town for about 11 years, but to get there, you had to go over 23 bridges that got washed out, and by the 1930s and into the 40s, people had just given up and moved all the stuff to a closer area of the pass, and the town deteriorated. Here's some pictures that we took of the area when we visited. You can see a spike from some rail line, it looks like. And here in the upper pictures here you find the workings of the mine and what remains there below. Here's another the old days compared with a picture of what it originally looked like. Now, as I mentioned before, I tried to get as much publicity as I possibly could and put a positive spin on the experience. The kids, of course, loved it, and for the most part, and they helped. And as long as we could keep people happy and kids excited, I figured the whole process would go on. But as time went on, people started thinking back to the basics and keep the kids in school, know where they are and all that kind of stuff. So I could see the writing was on the wall, which is why I eventually got out of it, left teaching. But I was interested in the living history idea of learning and appreciating the past. Frenchie Reviere. Frenchie Reviere was a mountain man of sorts who lived in his own little cabin up in the Pincher Creek area, Porcupine Hills, into the mountains. He spent later years, he was quite a fixture around Waterton Lakes, but when his wife died, he built a cabin up in the hills, and we visited the cabin, and a lot of it was left the way it was when he died. I believe his grave was up there as well. Up here you can see it in the lower right-hand picture, up in the hill. Halfway House. Halfway House refers to the stopping place where the stagecoach would cross the river on its way from Lethbridge to Fort Macleod. And when we went there in the 70s, there was still parts of the buildings were still there. And we're going to see them eventually. And here's the house, the smokehouse. The building as it used to look like. Artifacts that we spotted still there, including a sign that said Fort Kip. Fort Kip, Kip being nearby, which was an old trading post. A couple of pictures of the building as it deteriorated. And there we're taking a picture of the area where the cables were that took the ferry across the river when it was high. Another one of our exciting places that we visited was the Miners' Library. Now, Lethbridge was founded on coal, and you wonder, did they spend a lot of time reading? Well, they sure didn't by the time we arrived, which was in the 70s again. And by the rumor was that there were actually books there, although it was basically a social area and a beer parlor when we went there. But we went there and they took us and said, yes, there are a few books, we'll go find them. And so they took us down the basement and found a cupboard with some books, but it was locked. And eventually they found a key. It was getting a little rusty. They opened it up and there was this amazing collection of books. You could see that they're talking about Marxism and Darwinism and pretty fancy, deep books. But Lethbridge was a mining town. There's a lot of social problems that were going on, and people were obviously interested in the government changes that were coming around the world in the 20s and 30s, and that was part of their library. Another area that was really quite an interesting trip was the little miniature steam locomotive that we found. Now, the story on this is that originally tried shipping the coal from Lethbridge to Medicine Hat. Didn't work because the river wasn't deep enough, so they built a little narrow gauge railway, and that was used for a few years, and eventually it was upgraded, and they shipped the little narrow gauge engine to the Yoho Park area where they were building the spiral tunnels, famous spiral tunnels of the Rockies. When they were finally built, they just drove the train off the track and let it die in the forest. And we visited our little narrow gauge railway engine that was originally from Lethbridge. In the picture on the right, you can see it at Fort Macleod, at Medicine Hat, where it dumped the coal down into chutes, and the coal then went on the main line and was taken out of Medicine Hat across Canada.